I used to think fear was a loud thing. I pictured it as a shaking hand before a speech, or that stomach drop before you open a bill you don't want to see. That's what movies taught me fear looked like. Dramatic, obvious, and temporary. But the fear that shaped my life didn't arrive like a thunderclap. It arrived like good manners. It arrived as, be sensible, don't rock the boat, wait until you're ready. It arrived in a voice that sounded like me. I grew up in a house where being steady counted more than being happy. My dad worked, my mom kept the lights on with her own kind of grit, and nobody talked about dreams unless it was to laugh at someone else's. If you wanted something, you earned it quietly, and you didn't tell people until it was done. I learned early that hope could make you look foolish, and looking foolish was dangerous. So I trained myself to want things that wouldn't embarrass me. By 22, I had a job that looked good on paper and a life that fit inside other people's expectations. I told myself I was building a foundation. I said it like a grown man, the way I'd heard older men say it, like it was a moral choice. I didn't notice that my foundation was also a cage I was learning to decorate. I didn't feel trapped. I felt responsible. That's the trick. Fear doesn't always feel like fear. Sometimes it feels like being a good person. There was a night around that time, late summer, heat still clinging to the sidewalks, when my friend Marcus pulled up outside my apartment and laid on the horn like we were still 17. He had this wild idea, no planning, no excuses. Drive 2 states over for a weekend, see a band, sleep wherever we could, come back with stories. I remember looking at the clock, looking at the stack of mail, looking at my clean shirt laid out for Monday. My mouth said, I can't. My chest said, please. I told him I had work. I told him I had to be up early. I told him we could do it another time. He stared at me a long second and said, man, you talk like you're 50. Then he laughed like it was a joke, but it landed like a diagnosis. When he drove off, I stood in the doorway and felt something close behind me, like a shadow at my back. That was fear. It didn't grab me. It just waited, patient as dust, and I let it move in. That's the part people don't tell you. Fear doesn't need to ruin your life in one day. It only needs you to say not today long enough. It'll even reward you for it at first, with comfort and praise, and that calm pride of being responsible. And the scariest sentence I ever whispered to myself was, this is fine. The years that followed were full of little smart decisions that all pointed in the same direction, smaller. I took the promotion that paid more but demanded my weekends. I signed the longer lease because it was stable. I bought furniture that looked like adulthood and told myself that was progress. Every time a choice scared me, I found a reason it was irresponsible. I didn't call it fear. I called it planning. I met Claire in a way that felt safe too, through friends, in a place where everyone could see me being normal. She liked that I was steady. She said I made her feel protected. That word hit something soft inside me, because I'd built my whole identity around being the kind of man who didn't fall apart. I wanted to be that for her. I wanted to be that so badly I started sanding off anything in me that looked risky. There was a version of me that wrote songs on an old acoustic guitar late at night when the apartment was quiet. Nothing good enough to sell, nothing brave enough to share, but it was mine, When Claire moved in, I played less. Not because she asked me to stop, but because it felt childish to sit on the couch and chase a melody when there were dishes and bills and real life. Fear loves chores. Fear loves the endless list. If it can keep you busy, it can keep you small. One Friday, a guy from work mentioned an opening at a smaller company, less pay at first, but more creative work, more room to grow. I felt my heart thump like it was trying to get my attention. Claire asked, "Do you want it?" And I said, "It's not the right time." I watched her face do that tiny shift people do when they file you away as someone who won't surprise them. She didn't get angry. That would have been easier. She just got quieter, like she'd learned where the limits were. I told myself I was protecting our future. But the truth is, I was protecting my image of myself as the responsible one. I was protecting my fear of being the man who tried and failed. I was protecting myself from the shame of wanting more. I didn't realize how expensive that protection was, because the bill didn't arrive all at once. It arrived in small withdrawals, less laughter, fewer friends, a relationship that became efficient instead of alive. I still remember a Sunday morning, the kind where sunlight turns dust into gold. Claire was making coffee, hair up, wearing one of my old shirts. She asked almost casually, "Do you ever feel like we're waiting for life to start?" I wanted to say yes so badly it burned. Instead, I smiled and said, "We're doing good." That's a line fear teaches you. It sounds like gratitude. It can also be surrender. Here's what scares me now. I can trace the outline of my life by the things I didn't do because I was being smart. You don't notice you're disappearing. You just notice you're tired. And you call that adulthood. Fear wasn't only about career or dreams. It seeped into the way I spoke and the way I loved. I avoided hard conversations the same way I avoided big risks, by telling myself silence was kindness. If I didn't say the thing, maybe it wouldn't become real. Maybe the problem would solve itself. Maybe time would do the job I was too scared to do with my own mouth. Claire and I were good at logistics. We were good at being polite. We were good at not fighting. People praised us for it. "You two never argue," they'd say, like it was proof of maturity. I'd nod, proud of our control, not realizing we were slowly starving something that needed heat to live. Love can survive a storm. Sometimes it can't survive a drought. The first time Claire cried about us, it wasn't a dramatic scene. It was on a Tuesday, late, with the TV flickering in the background. She said, "I feel alone in this with you right next to me. I reached for a solution like I always did. I promised date nights. I promised to be more present. I promised to do the things that sounded safe. What I didn't do was ask her what she needed and then actually face the answer." I can see myself on that couch, nodding like a man taking notes. I thought if I behaved correctly, I could avoid the messy part. But the messy part was the point. She didn't want a manager. She wanted a partner. Fear makes you competent. It also makes you emotionally lazy. That sentence hurts to write, but it's true. Around that time, my dad got sick. Nothing dramatic at first, just little declines that you can pretend are temporary. Watching him shrink in his own body cracked something open in me. He'd been the definition of steady, and now steady wasn't protecting him. One afternoon, while I was driving home from the hospital, it hit me like a wave. The clock was real. Time wasn't an idea. It was a thing that kept moving whether I acted or not. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my hands hurt. I didn't cry. I just felt late. That night, I pulled the guitar out and played, like I was trying to call myself back. Claire listened from the doorway. When I finished, she said softly, "Where's that been?" Her voice wasn't accusing, it was grieving. I wanted to tell her I'd buried it because I was scared. I wanted to say I didn't know how to be a man and still be alive inside. Instead, I joked about being rusty, and she smiled politely, and we both returned to the safe version of us. Fear doesn't only stop you from doing things, it stops you from telling the truth. And the truth was simple. I was terrified that if I reached for a bigger life, I'd lose the life I already had. So I held on tighter, not realizing that holding on too tight is another way to lose. When my dad died, people told me I was strong. I accepted the compliment like a medal. Inside, I felt hollow. Strength can be a costume. Fear taught me how to wear it well. After the funeral, the house was full of casseroles and voices and the kind of sympathy that never quite reaches the person it's meant for. Everyone spoke about my dad like he'd been a safe harbor. He was dependable, they said. He did right by his family. All of that was true. It was also incomplete. There were things he wanted that he never named out loud, and I saw them in the way he'd stare a little too long at the horizon when he thought nobody was watching. A week later, I found a box in his closet. Old papers, photos, and a thin folder with a logo from a trade school. My dad had applied to learn electrical work when he was young. He'd been accepted. There was a letter dated decades ago with his name typed at the top. He'd never gone. Tucked behind it was a note in his handwriting. Not the right time. Family needs steady. My stomach dropped because I could hear my own voice inside that sentence. I took the folder home and put it on the table, like evidence. Claire looked at it, then at me, and said, "That's you." She didn't say it cruelly. She said it like a woman tired of watching someone she loved shrink. I wanted to argue, to defend my choices, but I couldn't. The truth sat there between us, plain. That night we talked for the first time in a long time. It wasn't pretty. There were long silences and sentences that came out wrong. Claire admitted she'd stopped bringing me her deeper feelings because I always responded with fixes instead of honesty. I admitted I'd been living like life was something I had to earn permission for. I heard myself say, "I'm scared," and it felt like stepping into cold water. My chest tightened, but I didn't die. That was a revelation. Naming fear doesn't kill you. Hiding it does. The next morning, I called the smaller company. The opening was gone. I stared at the phone after I hung up, feeling like I'd finally woken up and found the door locked. Fear has consequences that don't wait for your courage to catch up. I tried to make changes anyway. I started coming home earlier. I started saying yes to things that weren't efficient. I started playing guitar again, not like a secret, but like a part of me I was allowed to have. But Claire had been waiting a long time. Change is powerful, but timing matters. You can't neglect a garden for years and be surprised when the soil doesn't forgive you in a week. Claire said she needed space. I nodded like I understood, and I told myself it was temporary because hope still scared me. She moved out quietly. When the apartment door clicked shut behind her, the silence felt like punishment. but it was also clarity. I had been living in a story where caution always kept me safe, and now I was standing in the wreckage of that lie. Here's a line I wish I'd learned earlier. Fear doesn't protect you from loss. It only guarantees you'll lose on your knees. I didn't lose Claire because I took a risk. I lost her because I refused to take one. Living alone again in my 40s felt like waking up in a room I decorated for a person who never showed up. Everything was tidy, paid for, quiet. I kept expecting someone to walk in and tell me what to do next. Nobody did. Fear doesn't disappear just because you change the setting. It comes with you. I could feel it in the way I introduced myself, in the way I kept conversations polite, in the way I tried to be impressive instead of real. A year after Claire left, my friend Marcus called. We hadn't been close in a long time, not because of a fight, but because my life had gotten busy in that careful way. He told me he was coming through town for work and asked if I wanted to grab dinner. My first instinct was to say I couldn't. That reflex was still there, like an old scar that tightens in cold weather. I forced myself to say yes. We met at a little place with cheap beer and loud music. Marcus looked older too, but in a way that seemed lived in rather than worn down. He told me stories about jobs he'd taken, countries he'd visited, stupid decisions that had become good memories. He wasn't bragging. He was just alive. At one point, he said, "Remember that night I tried to get you to go see that band?" I laughed, and then I felt my throat close up. I told him the truth, that I'd been scared, not of the drive or the money, but of breaking the image I was clinging to. Marcus listened and said, "Man, I was scared too. I just hated the thought of being old and bored more." That sentence hit me like a slap and a gift at the same time. Old and bored. I'd walked into it. After dinner, he asked if I still played guitar. I said yes, then hesitated, then admitted I mostly didn't. He shook his head and said, "Bring it back." Not as advice, not as a lecture, like a friend reminding you of something you dropped. That weekend, I dug out my old notebooks, the ones with half-finished lyrics and scribbled chords. I felt ridiculous, like I was pretending to be my younger self. Fear whispered, "You missed your window." But another voice, quieter, steadier, said, "Then open a new one." I started writing again, not to be famous, not to prove anything, but to stop disappearing. I signed up for a community music night at a coffee shop. The day of, I almost didn't go. My shirt didn't feel right. My hands felt clumsy. My brain produced a dozen sensible reasons to stay home. That was fear, dressed up as quality control. I went anyway. I stood on a small stage with a cheap microphone and sang a song I'd written about my dad's folder in the closet. My voice cracked on the second verse. People still clapped. When I sat down afterward, my whole body was shaking. I expected shame. What I felt instead was relief, like I'd been holding my breath for years and finally exhaled. I realized something simple. Fear had been stealing my life in exchange for comfort, and comfort wasn't even keeping its promises. My 50s arrived like a quiet verdict, not dramatic, not tragic, just the steady accumulation of choices. I could see patterns now that I couldn't see when I was younger. I could see how often I'd confused not ready with never. I could see how I'd used responsibility as a shield to avoid vulnerability. I could also see that the story wasn't finished, unless I decided it was. I started doing one thing weekly that made me nervous. Nothing reckless, just honest. Calling someone instead of texting. Saying what I meant the first time. Applying for the role I assumed I couldn't get. Taking a trip alone. Sitting with silence without filling it with noise. These were acts, rebellions against the version of me that always chose the safest route. One of those acts was writing Claire a letter. Not a pleading letter, not a dramatic apology that demanded a response, but a clean truth. I told her I finally understood what she'd meant about being alone with me right next to her. I told her I'd been scared to be fully seen, because being fully seen meant someone could fully leave. I admitted I'd chosen control. I told her I was sorry, without trying to bargain my way out of the consequences. I mailed it and didn't follow up. Months later, she sent a short note back. She said she was glad I was finding my way. She said she'd loved me. She said she couldn't come back. It hurt, but it didn't destroy me, because by then, I'd started learning a different kind of strength. The kind that can hold regret without turning it into bitterness. I kept playing music. I kept showing up. Over time, the coffee shop gigs turned into small local events, and those turned into a little circle of people who knew me as the guy who wrote honest songs. I wasn't famous. I wasn't rich. But when I looked in the mirror, I recognized the man looking back. That mattered more than the metrics I'd chased in my 30s. Driving home after a set, I realized I wasn't rehearsing my mistakes anymore. I was just present. That felt like freedom, and it made me mourn how long I'd lived afraid of embarrassment. As if embarrassment was worse than disappearing, fear still visited. When someone asked me a serious question about my past, my plans, I felt the old urge to deflect, but I practiced staying. I practiced telling the truth. The strange thing was, the more honest I became, the less fear had to do. Secrets give fear a home. Honesty evicts it. I met a woman named Denise at one of the music nights. She wasn't dazzled by my steadiness. She was interested in my humanness instead. On our third date, she said, "You seem like a man who used to hide." I almost laughed, because it was so accurate it felt like she'd read my file. I told her, yeah, I did. Then I told her why. My voice shook a little. She didn't flinch. That's another thing aging taught me. Most of the fear I carried was imaginary debt. I paid interest on it for decades. The moment I started paying with truth instead of avoidance, the balance dropped fast. In my 60s, I started noticing how fear wears different masks. In younger men, it can look like ambition, chasing so hard you never have to sit still long enough to feel the emptiness. In older men, it can look like bitterness, complaining so you never have to admit your own choices. I saw both in myself, and neither one was the truth. The truth was simpler. I had been afraid of being ordinary, not in the humble, honest way, more like afraid of being forgettable, afraid of being laughed at, afraid of reaching for something and failing in public. So I settled for being quietly unhappy in private, because nobody could judge that. That's a brutal trade. It's common. We learn early what gets applause and what gets silence, and we start buying applause even when it costs us our life. I volunteer at a community center because I can't stand hoarding whatever I've learned. I listen more than I talk. But sometimes a younger guy will pull me aside and say, "How do you know what to do with your life?" and I can see the panic behind the question. He's hoping for a blueprint that guarantees he won't regret anything. I understand that hunger. I lived on it. I don't give him a speech. I tell him a story. I tell him about Marcus at my door and the way I said no, like it was maturity. I tell him about the folder in my dad's closet. I tell him about the couch with Claire crying while I offered solutions like bandages. I tell him about standing on a small stage with my voice cracking and people clapping anyway. I tell him that fear won't announce itself as fear. It will call itself being realistic. It will call itself waiting for the right time. It will call itself protecting what you have. Then it will take what you have anyway. Sometimes the guy nods. Sometimes he smiles politely, the way I used to. You can't force courage into someone. You can only show them what fear costs. Last year I had a health scare. Tests and waiting rooms to make time feel sharp. Sitting in those sterile chairs, I realized I wasn't bargaining the way I used to. I felt gratitude that I'd finally started living like my life belonged to me. When I got the good news, I drove home slow. I passed parks and diners and ordinary streets, and it hit me that ordinary was never the enemy. Avoidance was. Ordinary life can be beautiful when you're actually inside it. Fear keeps you watching through the window. That night I called Marcus. We're old now, both of us. We laughed about stupid things, like men do when they don't know how to say, "I love you," directly. Before we hung up, I told him, "Thanks for trying to pull me out of my apartment." There was a pause, and he said, "You're out now." That line landed in my chest. Here's what I know in my bones. Fear shrinks your world one reasonable choice at a time. Courage doesn't have to be heroic. It has to be consistent. You don't need a new personality. You need one honest decision, repeated, until it becomes your life. I'm telling you this at the age when people start speaking about you in past tense, even while you're still sitting at the table. I've watched friends become stories. That's why I refuse the easy conclusion that it's too late. Too late is another fear phrase. It sounds wise. It's usually just surrender wearing a suit. If you ask what growing old taught me about fear, I'll tell you this. Fear is not an emergency. It's a lifestyle. It rewards you with comfort and charges you with regret. Sometimes it gives you a life that looks fine and feels dead. I used to think the goal was to avoid pain. Now I think the goal is to avoid numbness. Numbness is what you get when you say later too many times and start believing the lie. There's a scene I replay sometimes, not to torture myself, but to remember the cost. It's that Sunday morning with sunlight in the kitchen. Claire asking if we're waiting for life to start. I can see my own smile like a mask. I can hear my own voice saying, "We're doing good." If I could go back, I wouldn't fix it with a date night. I wouldn't fix it with a new plan. Well, I would take her hands, look her in the eyes and say, "I'm scared, and I don't want fear to run us anymore." That's the sentence. It's simple. It's terrifying. It's also a doorway. I can't go back. So I go forward with as much honesty as I can carry. I make the call. I play the song. I tell the truth faster. I let people see me, even when it costs me. I keep choosing the thing that makes me slightly nervous, because that nervousness is often just life knocking from the inside. Some nights I sit on my porch with the guitar across my lap and the air cool around my ankles, and I think about my dad's note. Not the right time. I don't hate him for it. I understand him. He was doing what he thought a good man does. But I also feel a quiet anger at the way fear can be inherited like a family heirloom, passed down with love and called wisdom. I'm trying to be the man who breaks that pattern, even now, even late. If you're listening to this and you're younger than me, don't make the mistake of thinking you have to be fearless. You don't. You just have to stop letting fear vote. Fear can have an opinion. It can't have the final say. The final say belongs to you, even when your hands shake. And if you're older, if you feel like you missed your window, hear me clearly. The window isn't a single moment. It's a habit of choosing. Start with one honest move, then do it again. Your life will widen. I spent too many years waiting for confidence to arrive like permission. Confidence doesn't arrive first. Action arrives first. Growing old didn't make me braver by magic. It just made the bill impossible to ignore. And once you see the bill, you have a choice. Keep paying in regret or pay in courage. I'm paying in courage now. I only wish I'd started sooner.